This will be our double-sized grand finale episode of our early modern mega-documentary. We will be picking up where our episodes on the Age of Discovery and early modern Europe ended. So watch those first if you'd like more context. Our main focus for this final episode will be revolutions. Though the most famous are probably the American or French revolutions, intellectual revolutions also occurred, like the Enlightenment. But this had its origins in a slightly earlier movement, a revolution of science. Beginning still during the later part of the Renaissance, it challenged the dominant methods of thinking about the natural world. Philosophers had used works by Aristotle and Ptolemy, one of the greatest astronomers of the classical era, combined with their own beliefs, to form the geocentric theory of the universe. In this theory, also known as the Ptolemaic system, Earth is the stationary center of the universe, with all celestial objects, including the sun, moon, planets, and stars, revolving around it in circular or epicycle motions. The model consisted of 9 or 10 spheres, the first 7 representing the sun, moon, and visible planets up to Saturn. Beyond that was a sphere which held the stars and constellations, which moved east to west across the night sky. The outermost sphere was called the prime mover and was responsible for setting all the other spheres into motion. Yet further beyond was the empyrean heaven, where lived the Christian God and the souls that achieved salvation. In 1543, Nicholas Copernicus, a Polish polymath, published his seminal work on the revolutions of the celestial spheres. Copernicus proposed that it was the sun, not the Earth, which was the center of the solar system. This heliocentric idea was revolutionary at the time, as it challenged both the prevailing Ptolemaic geocentric model and the theological viewpoints that aligned with a geocentric universe. Copernicus was well educated, having studied at various universities in Poland and Italy, where he was exposed to astronomy, mathematics, and the works of classical authors. He was particularly influenced by the writings of ancient Greek philosophers and astronomers like Aristarchus of Samos, who had proposed a heliocentric system. Copernicus found the geocentric model, with its complex system of epicycles and deferents, unsatisfactory, cumbersome, and inelegant. It also struggled to accurately predict planetary positions and celestial events. Although Copernicus did not have access to a telescope, which was invented later, he made meticulous observations using the instruments available at the time. His observations, coupled with his mathematical calculations, led him to conclude that many of the complexities of the geocentric model could be resolved with a heliocentric system. Though he was not the first to conceive a heliocentric universe, he was the first in the Western world to develop a comprehensive mathematical model that explained planetary observations more simply than the geocentric model. His system still used circular orbits and epicycles, like Ptolemy's model, but did away with many of the complexities required by a geocentric system. Further building on the model, German mathematician and astronomer Johannes Kepler arrived at the 3 laws of planetary motion, which confirmed and refined the heliocentric theory by proposed elliptical orbits rather than circular. In the early 1600s, the next breakthrough was made by an Italian teacher of mathematics, Galileo Galilei. He was one of the first to look to the heavens and denote his observations with a new invention, the telescope. Galileo discovered the large moons of Jupiter, now known as the Galilean moons. He also observed sunspots, demonstrating that the sun was not a perfect, unchanging body. He also observed the rough and cratered surface of the moon, challenging the Aristotelian belief in the perfection of celestial bodies. The world beyond Earth wasn't an ethereal realm, but just more of the same substance. Galileo's support for the heliocentric model brought him into conflict with the Catholic Church, which held to the geocentric view based on certain scriptural interpretations. In 1632, after publishing Dialogue concerning the 2 chief world systems, which defended the heliocentric model, Galileo was tried by the Inquisition and found vehemently suspect of heresy. he was forced to recant his views and spent the rest of his life under house arrest. Today, he is considered the father of modern observational astronomy. The scientific revolution culminated in the late 1600s, with an Englishman who brought together the ideas of the Polish Copernicus, German Kepler, and Italian Galileo. This was Isaac Newton, and standing on the shoulders of his predecessors, would come to synthesize their knowledge and become one of the most influential scientists of all time. In his work, Principia, he formulates his laws of motion and universal gravitation. He not only defined the laws that governed the planetary bodies, but also Earth and everything on it. Central to this was the explanation at the basis of the heliocentric model, the elliptical orbits, and why planets don't just fly off in different directions. The universal law of gravitation. Because all objects had a certain gravity and were attracted to each other, the universe became seen as one large machine. This conception of the universe, often referred to as the Newtonian world machine, or simply the clockwork universe, is rooted in the idea that the universe is like a vast and deterministic machine that operates predictably and consistently based on a set of universal laws. This idea is fundamentally tied to Newton's laws of motion and universal gravitation. This worldview came to dominate academia until the 20th century, when Einstein's theory of relativity and the development of quantum mechanics uncovered more answers and more questions. France joined in as well, as French philosopher René Descartes offered a newer system of thought based on doubt. He began by systematically doubting everything he could possibly doubt, like sensory information and even the existence of the physical world, to establish what could be known with absolute certainty. He arrived at the conclusion that while he could doubt the existence of everything else, he could not doubt the fact that he was thinking. This led to his formation of one of the most recognized sayings in philosophy: cogito ergo sum, or I think, therefore I am. Since he could be certain he was thinking, he could be certain he existed. He separated the mind from the material world in what is called Cartesian dualism. For Descartes, the mind is non-physical and is the seat of consciousness and rationality. Its substance is immaterial and indivisible. It's the thinking thing, or res cogitans, and is characterized by its ability to doubt, understand, affirm, deny, want, sense and imagine. The body, in contrast, is material and occupies space. It operates in the physical realm and can be divided, measured, and described in terms of its extension, or res extensa, extended thing. It's subject to the mechanical laws of nature. Descartes is still one of the most influential philosophers and has been called the father of modern rationalism. Later, another intellectual movement would occur. It built on ideas from the scientific revolution, applying reason and rationality in fields other than science. This period, from the mid-1600s to around 1800, has been called an age of illumination. An age of enlightenment. Reason and progress became the order of the day. Based on Isaac Newton's view of the world machine, it was thought that natural laws could be discovered for all facets of life, like in politics, economics, or religion. One of the most important Enlightenment thinkers was John Locke. In his work, An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, Locke proposed the idea of the mind as a tabula rasa, or blank slate. He argued that humans are born without innate ideas and that knowledge is determined by experience derived from sense perceptions. This stance positioned him against the views of philosophers like Descartes, who believed in innate ideas. As people were molded by their surroundings, environments could in theory be changed to create a more enlightened society. One of Locke's most influential works, the Two Treatises of Government, was published anonymously in 1689. In it, Locke refuted the idea of the divine right of kings and proposed instead that political authority is rooted in the consent of the governed. He argued for a social contract wherein individuals give up some freedoms to a government, in exchange for the protection of their natural rights. The great thinkers of this time were collectively called philosophes, though they were not all French, nor were they all philosophers. Early Enlightenment thinkers came from Germany and England, most likely out of the chaos of the mid-1600s in their respective states. But it was France which produced some of the most influential minds from this era, a response to the truly absolutist rule of Louis XIV. Three of the most notable Enlightenment thinkers are Montesquieu, Voltaire, and Diderot. Montesquieu argued for the separation of powers, which later significantly influenced the framers of the United States Constitution. Montesquieu warned against despotism and stressed the importance of checks and balances in a government to prevent any one branch from gaining absolute power. Voltaire was a sharp critic of organized religion, especially the Catholic Church, though he often expressed deist beliefs, viewing the Creator through the lens of Newton's world machine. He remained an advocate for freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and a strong critic of corrupt institutions, intolerance, and injustice. The French philosopher praised the religious tolerance he observed in England and contrasted it with the less tolerant institutions of his home country. Enlightenment thinkers didn't always have to be political, though. Diderot is perhaps best known as the chief editor and a significant contributor to the Encyclopédie, an ambitious project that aimed to catalogue and disseminate all human knowledge. All three of these figures, Montesquieu with his political theories, Voltaire with his wit and advocacy for freedom and justice, and Diderot with his commitment to disseminating knowledge, played crucial roles in shaping Enlightenment thought and, by extension, the modern world. They exemplify the period of the mid-1700s, what has been called the High Enlightenment. With the belief that natural law applied everywhere, the philosophe began trying to apply these laws in all aspects of life, like economics and politics, and how these in turn governed human beings and society. The social sciences. One of these was economics. The discipline of modern economics has in part been attributed to Adam Smith, who based his ideas on individuals being able to pursue their own economic self-interest. If the state leaves individuals alone, a system called laissez-faire, all individuals in theory should be able to benefit. The Wealth of Nations is Smith's most famous work, and it laid the foundational concepts for classical economics. He also argued against mercantilism, the prevailing economic theory of the time, which held that a nation's gain was another's loss. Smith instead argued that trade could be mutually beneficial. Smith did see roles for government in areas like defense, justice, and certain public works. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a Genevan philosopher, was active during the High Enlightenment period. The social contract emphasized popular sovereignty and the general will of the people, as opposed to absolute monarchy. His discourse on inequality argued that private property was the basis of inequality. His novels Emile, or On Education, presented a new view on education and human nature, arguing that education shouldn't restrict a child's natural instincts. Rousseau also viewed women as naturally different from men, and that they were to be educated in roles as wives and mothers, or nurturing and obedience. While this type of thinking was common, women still made great strides during the Enlightenment. Maria Winkelmann made significant contributions to astronomy, most famously discovering a comet in 1702. But because of the biases of her time, her husband Gottfried Kirch, a well-known astronomer, was initially credited with the discovery. She was not allowed to attend university or join the Berlin Academy, but still managed to publish her findings under her husband's name. But women's rights soon advanced through Mary Wollstonecraft, whose work laid foundational ideas for both feminism and women's rights movements. A Vindication of the Rights of Woman is her most renowned work. She contended that both men and women should be treated as rational beings and imagined a social order founded on reason. This meant giving women the same educational opportunities as men in order to better teach their children and be a better companion and friend to their husband instead of merely domestic caretaker. Wollstonecraft later married the philosopher William Godwin, one of the forefathers of the anarchist movement. She died shortly after giving birth to their daughter, Mary Godwin, who would later become Mary Shelley, the author of what is often regarded as the first science fiction novel, Frankenstein. With the Enlightenment came cultural change. We discussed how the Baroque style emerged in an earlier episode, but by the early 1700s, a newer art style spread throughout Europe. This was Rococo, derived from the French word rocaille, meaning rock and shell garden ornamentation. The movement began in France and primarily remained a French style, although it did influence other European countries. It is characterized by lightness, elegance, playfulness, and an emphasis on asymmetrical designs, curved forms, and detailed ornamentation. Rococo used soft pastels and creamy tones, creating a lighter and more delicate visual impression. The subject matter is often more frivolous and focuses on love, nature, and playful scenes, as contrasted with the grander and heroic elements of the Baroque style. It also depicted aristocratic life and leisure. Antoine Watteau was a French painter who played a crucial role in defining the Rococo style in the early 18th century. His works, characterized by their charm, elegance, and delicate color palette, mark a departure from the grandeur and formality of Baroque art and pave the way for the more playful and intimate Rococo style. Watteau is particularly known for pioneering the genre of fête gala art, which depicted scenes of courtly parties, picnics, and other social gatherings in dreamlike, pastoral settings. These scenes are often infused with a sense of nostalgia and melancholy. Ironically, because of Rococo's grace and ease, decorative Rococo works were often easily placed in Baroque buildings. Balthasar Neumann was a prominent German architect and military artillery engineer of the Baroque and Rococo eras. He is best known for his contributions to the design of churches, palaces, and residences, which showcase the ornate splendor of the time. His structures are renowned for their sophisticated form, elegant interiors, and elaborate decorative elements. One of Neumann's most famous works is the Würzburg residence in Bavaria, Germany. The Enlightenment had a profound impact on European nobility and state development. Political order came to include a series of natural rights, including equality before the law, right to property, and freedom of the press, among others. But though these ideals limited the power of government, a ruler was still needed to preserve these natural rights. The philosophe believed that rulers themselves should be enlightened. This led to the advent of a new type of monarchy called enlightened despotism or enlightened absolutism. The monarch took on a parental role, acting in the best interests of their population. The rights of rulers were no longer given by a divine source, but by the people. The most prolific of these enlightened monarchs were from Prussia, Austria, and Russia. We last left these three states at the end of our episode on early modern Europe. Over in Russia, after the death of Peter the Great in 1725, the throne witnessed a series of rulers, some of whom had very short reigns. Catherine I, Peter the Great's second wife and former handmaiden, became empress after his death. Her reign was relatively short, and during her time on the throne, much of the actual power was held by the Supreme Privy Council. Peter II, grandson of Peter the Great, was only a child when he began his reign, but died of smallpox at the age of just 14. Anna Ivanovna, daughter of Peter the Great's half-brother Ivan, was initially expected to be a puppet ruler with limited powers, but she managed to abolish the Supreme Privy Council and rule autocratically. Her reign saw the influence of her German lover, Ernst Johann Byron, and was marked by extravagance and some notorious episodes, such as the Tale of the Ice Palace. This structure was entirely made of ice blocks, complete with ice furniture, an ice elephant, and other ice sculptures. It was an architectural marvel of its time, demonstrating the skill of Russian artisans in ice construction, but it's better remembered for the grim event associated with it. Anna Ivanovna used the ice palace as the setting for a cruel jest. she ordered a mock wedding between two of her court jesters. One was known to have displeased the empress, and this event was both a punishment and a form of entertainment. The couple was paraded through the city in a cage on an elephant, dressed in clownish, deliberately humiliating costumes. As the climax of the event, they were forced to spend the night in the ice palace in sub-zero temperatures. It's said that a special bed, also made of ice, was prepared for them. To ensure their compliance, Anna had a guard posted. Surprisingly, both survived the night, allegedly by bribing the guard to bring them warm fur coats. The next monarch, Ivan VI, was proclaimed emperor as an infant, but his reign was extremely brief. His mother, Anna Leopoldovna, who acted as regent, was not popular, and a coup soon dethroned Ivan. He spent the rest of his life imprisoned, and was later killed by his jailers. It was Elizabeth Petrovna, daughter of Peter the Great and Catherine, who seized the throne from Ivan in a bloodless coup, and became empress. Her reign is generally seen as a period of relative stability and prosperity for Russia. Elizabeth refrained from executing anyone for state crimes during her reign, a notable contrast to some of her predecessors and successors. She was also responsible for significant cultural advancements and the foundation of the University of Moscow. After Elizabeth's death, Peter III ascended to the throne, but his reign would last only a matter of months. Peter made a series of decisions that were unpopular with certain factions of the Russian military and nobility. His wife, Catherine, with the support of these factions, orchestrated a coup that resulted in Peter's abdication and subsequent mysterious death, allowing her to become the empress. Catherine II then brought back stability, ruling from 1762 to 1796. Marking her place as one of the enlightened despots of the late 1700s and one of the most notable reigns in Russian history. Her reign is considered the golden age of the Russian Empire, marked by territorial expansion, domestic reforms, and a flourishing of arts and culture, giving her the title of Catherine the Great. Catherine aimed to expand Russian influence in the Black Sea region and the Balkans at the expense of the weakening Ottoman Empire. There were two major Russo-Turkish wars during her reign. Catherine was a patron of the arts, literature, and education. She corresponded with many Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Diderot, and expanded the collections of the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. Catherine's reign wasn't without domestic strife. The most significant challenge was Pugachev's rebellion, a widespread revolt against serfdom and oppressive governance. The revolt was eventually suppressed, and Pugachev tortured and executed, but it underscored the tensions in Russian society and even made Catherine more antagonistic to the peasantry. While Catherine considered enlightened principles, she also expanded the institution of serfdom in Russia, tying peasants more firmly to the land and their landlords. Catherine the Great's reign left an indelible mark on Russian history. She transformed the nation into a major European power, engaged with the Enlightenment, though selectively, and left a cultural legacy that's evident in Russia to this day. However, her reign also deepened the divide between the ruling elite and the peasantry, setting the stage for social tensions that would play out in the centuries that followed. In Prussia, which elevated itself to a kingdom under Frederick I, his son, Frederick William, became king in Prussia in 1713. Known as the Soldier King, Frederick William was a stark contrast to his father. He is best known for his military and administrative reforms, establishing Prussia as an efficient and militarized state. He significantly expanded the Prussian army and made it one of the finest in Europe, albeit at great economic cost. His reforms laid the groundwork for Prussia's later military successes, most notably under his son, Frederick II, who ruled from 1740 to 1786. Frederick, who became known as Frederick the Great, was one of the most educated and intelligent rulers of all European rulers during the 1700s, and is often cited as one of the quintessential examples of an enlightened monarch. Prominent Enlightenment thinker Voltaire was even invited to live with him in Prussia for many years. He initiated reforms for religious tolerance, the legal system, and expanded the military. Even as he introduced reforms, Frederick was pragmatic and did not challenge the social order fundamentally. He did not emancipate the serfs or drastically reduce the privileges of the nobility, recognizing their importance to the Prussian military system. The army was increased to 200,000 troops, and Prussia became synonymous with an exceptional military. While Frederick the Great was undoubtedly influenced by the Enlightenment and introduced many reforms, Enlightened Absolutism was still, fittingly, absolute. His primary interests were the power, prestige, and territorial expansion of Prussia. Over in Austria, we had last left Leopold I after his involvement in the war with the Ottomans, and the War of Spanish Succession. Joseph I, Leopold's eldest son, became emperor upon his father's death. His reign, although brief, was marked by continued military and diplomatic engagements. Charles VI succeeded his brother Joseph. His reign saw the end of the Austro-Turkish War, which resulted in significant territorial gains for the Habsburgs in the Balkans. Like his predecessors, Charles was a patron of the arts. He is particularly noted for his patronage of music, including the composer Johann Sebastian Bach. But his reign was mostly dominated by concerns over succession and the future of the Habsburg dynasty. This powerful ruler of the vast Habsburg Empire had no male heirs. Determined to secure his daughter Maria Theresa's right to succeed him, he issued the Pragmatic Sanction, a royal decree recognized by most European powers. But when Charles VI died in 1740, the ink on those diplomatic agreements was barely dry. Maria Theresa ascended to the throne, facing immediate challenges to her rule. Europe's powers, seeing an opportunity in a realm ruled by a young woman, began to question her legitimacy. Several European states saw the Habsburg succession as an opportunity to expand their territories, or to shift the balance of power in Europe. The first to act was Frederick the Great of Prussia. Eyeing the rich province of Silesia, he invaded, setting off a chain of events that plunged Europe into war. This was to be the War of the Austrian Succession. This major conflict grew to engulf areas all over the Holy Roman Empire, the Low Countries, and Italy. Maria Theresa's position initially seemed dire, with Bohemia being occupied by Bavaria, and the title of Holy Roman Emperor going to Charles Albert of Bavaria, as Charles VII in 1742. The war saw a complex set of shifting alliances. The main factions on Austria's side were Great Britain and the Dutch, while Prussia was supported by longtime Habsburg rivals in France, along with Bourbon Spain and Bavaria, who attempted to begin a new line of emperors after the Habsburgs. The war wasn't confined to Central Europe. The conflict spilled over into the Italian peninsula, the Low Countries, and even the colonies, a story we'll get to later on in this episode. The War of the Austrian Succession concluded with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748. The terms of the peace were that Maria Theresa's right to rule her dominions was recognized. But Prussia officially got to retain most of Silesia. All other territories occupied during the war were returned to their pre-war status. Charles Albert's son, who became Elector of Bavaria after his father's death, renounced his claims to the Austrian succession. During Maria Theresa's reign, she initiated numerous reforms that centralized power for the Habsburgs. Maria Theresa was personally conservative, particularly in her religious views. She did not champion the broad religious tolerance that some other enlightened despots promoted. In fact, she was notably intolerant of Protestantism and Judaism. Her marriage to Francis, Duke of Lorraine, allowed him to become crowned Holy Roman Emperor, as Francis I in 1745. This union effectively merged the House of Habsburg, one of Europe's most influential royal houses, with the House of Lorraine. While Maria's reign introduced several reforms that were in line with Enlightenment ideals, her personal conservatism and religious views meant that she is not as clear-cut an example of an enlightened despot as her son, Joseph II became emperor in 1765, but ruled alongside his mother until her death in 1780. As the son of Maria Theresa and Francis I, he was the first Austrian ruler from the combined House of Habsburg-Lorraine. He's often characterized as one of the most radical Enlightened Absolutists of his era. He shared little with his more conservative mother, going ahead and abolishing serfdom. He also established state-run hospitals, reduced the power of the church in medical affairs, and revamped the education system to be more secular and centralized. Joseph aimed for uniformity in administration and law, initiating the codification of laws with the goal of establishing a centralized legal system. Emphasizing religious tolerance, he issued the Edict of Tolerance in 1781, granting certain rights to non-Catholic Christians living in the Habsburg dominions. This was followed by the Toleration Patent, which expanded those religious freedoms. He also reduced the influence of the Catholic Church in matters of state and education, and dissolved many monastic orders that he deemed unproductive. His reforms were considered too radical, though, and he displeased the nobility by freeing the serfs, and alienated the church with his religious tolerance and limits to their influence. After his death, many of his reforms were rolled back under the rule of his brother and successor, Leopold II. This period of reversal is often called the Reaction. One of the most significant geopolitical maneuvers during this period was the series of partitions of Poland. Between 1772 and 1795, Russia, Prussia, and Austria participated in 3 separate partitions of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, effectively wiping Poland off the map. It would not be re-established until 1918. Prussia's seizure of the wealthy province of Silesia made it clear that they were now a rival to Austrian dominance within the Holy Roman Empire. Britain, primarily a naval and colonial power, was mainly concerned about France's overseas ambitions. The rising threat of Prussia in continental Europe was of less concern to the British. Thus, they saw an alignment with Prussia as a way to keep France occupied in Europe, thereby limiting French challenges to British overseas interests. Maria Theresa of Austria had never reconciled with the loss of Silesia to Prussia. Wishing to regain the territory and realizing the need for strong allies, Austria began to look towards traditional rival France for support. France, traditionally allied with Prussia, was now aligned with Austria, while Britain, traditionally aligned with Austria, was now partnered with Prussia. These new alliances became known as the Diplomatic Revolution of 1756. But the stage was set for the 7 Years' War. Though Enlightenment ideals condemned it, Europe engaged in its most dramatic conflict of the 18th century. Austria, France, along with Russia, would face off against Britain and Prussia. The war began with Prussia's surprise invasion of Saxony in 1756. Frederick the Great quickly occupied Saxony and then moved into Bohemia. In 1757, Frederick defeated the Austrians at the Battle of Prague, but his subsequent siege of the city failed. Later that year, he was defeated at the Battle of Kolin and was forced to retreat from Bohemia. Sweden declared war on Prussia in 1757 and began a campaign in Pomerania in 1758, though they achieved limited success. The Russian army began its campaigns against East Prussia. In 1758, the Russians defeated the Prussians at the Battle of Zorndorf, but the battle was so costly for both sides that neither could follow up on their respective advantages. The key battle in this phase was the Battle of Rossbach in 1757, where Frederick spectacularly defeated the combined French and Austrian forces. In 1758, the Austrians, trying to reclaim Silesia, were defeated at the Battle of Hochkirch, though Frederick was forced to retreat afterward. In 1759, the Russian and Austrian army won a decisive victory at the Battle of Kunersdorf, the worst defeat of Frederick's career. By 1761, Prussia was under extreme pressure. The Russians occupied Berlin temporarily, and the Austrians continued to press in Silesia. But in 1762, a sudden turn of events favored Prussia. The Russian Empress Elizabeth died, and her successor, Peter III, admired Frederick the Great. Russia made peace and even became a brief ally to Prussia. This change, coupled with the ongoing drain of resources and manpower, led to a general desire for peace among the European states. The war ended with the Treaty of Paris between Great Britain, France, Spain, and Portugal, and the Treaty of Hubertusburg between Prussia and the Habsburgs. This marked the beginnings of a century of rivalry, as the Prussian lion and Austrian elephant menacingly encircled one another. Despite the vast scale of the conflict and the significant territorial exchanges in other theaters, the European borders essentially returned to the status quo, and Prussia retained its control over Silesia. In the end, the 7 Years' War in Europe confirmed the rise of Prussia as a major European power and highlighted the military genius of Frederick the Great, as he managed to resist the combined might of several larger powers. This war touched the European colonies as well. With the Treaty of Paris, the French abandoned the lucrative trade in India to the British. But the greatest conflicts outside of Europe occurred in North America, where lay significant French and British colonies. We last visited the Americas during our Age of Discovery episode, where we mostly went over the Spanish and Portuguese colonies, but only touched on French and English explorations. After Jacques Cartier laid claim to Canada as a French possession, Samuel de Champlain established a settlement in 1608 at Quebec. France wouldn't take interest in the colonies though until 1663, when Canada became property of the French crown and was appointed a governor, like other French provinces. France first claimed the vast territory of Louisiana in the late 17th century. The claim was a result of early exploration by Robert Cavelier, who traveled down the Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico in 1682. At the river's mouth, he conducted a ceremony to claim the entire Mississippi River basin for France, naming it Louisiana, in honor of King Louis XIV. But Louisiana would remain sparsely populated by colonists. Trading in furs became a lucrative business, and the French established a series of trading posts throughout the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River Valley. The French often had more cooperative relations with Native American societies as compared to the English and Dutch, promoting intermarriage and integration. The French, English, and Dutch would engage in a series of colonial wars throughout the 1600s. For the French, they became caught up in wars that began as a result of competition between native societies for dominance in the fur trade. In this region, many of these were of the Eastern Woodlands, a cultural area you can find out more about in our video about the ancient Americas. The Iroquois Confederacy, or Haudenosaunee, was a powerful alliance, originally of 5 tribes. The Iroquois sought to expand their territory to gain more access to animals, especially beavers, which were heavily hunted for their pelts, and monopolize the fur trade with European markets. Their rivals were societies like the Huron, Algonquin, and others from the Great Lakes. European demand for beaver pelts, used to make felt hats and other goods, made control of this trade economically lucrative for whichever natives took advantage. In 1609, Samuel de Champlain and his Huron and Algonquin allies fought against the Mohawk near Lake Champlain, establishing early French opposition to the Haudenosaunee. By the 1640s, the Haudenosaunee were launching devastating raids on the Huron and others from the region, displacing thousands and cementing their dominance. In 1689, the Native Confederacy attacked the settlement of Lachine on Montreal Island, burning it and killing most of the settlers. The Haudenosaunee succeeded in dispersing or assimilating several tribes in the region. But by the end of the wars, their power began to wane as they faced increased pressure from European colonists and other native tribes. The wars concluded with the signing of the Great Peace of Montreal in 1701, where the Haudenosaunee agreed to a peace treaty with the French and 39 other indigenous nations. The The Beaver Wars also played a role in that which decimated Native American populations, the spread of European diseases. Often overlooked, we should also share a moment of silence for the beaver, who didn't ask for any of this. Populations of beaver were all but wiped out, and it took hundreds of years for them to recover, while some areas lost them forever. Though settler populations rose slowly in New France, its territory reached its peak in 1712, and consisted of 5 distinct colonies. The Dutch weren't around as long, but the settlers of New Netherland under Director General Willem Kieft came into conflict with several Native American tribes, primarily the Lenape. Strains arose from the Dutch expansion, misunderstandings, and increasing demands the Dutch made on the Lenape. The immediate spark was Kieft's decision to tax the native population and his orders to attack Lenape camps. Following the orders of Governor Kieft, Dutch soldiers launched a nighttime attack on a Lenape encampment, and what followed could only be described as a massacre. This event led to retaliatory raids by the Lenape and their allies, causing widespread violence and disruption in the region. The war culminated in a significant loss of life, particularly for the Lenape. It ended with a tentative peace agreement, but the tensions paved the way for further Dutch Native American conflicts in subsequent years. Willem Kieft's decisions during the conflict were controversial, and he was later recalled to the Netherlands due to his handling of the situation, and by 1664, the English had taken the colony of New Netherland from the Dutch, renaming it New York. By the mid-1600s, the English had set up numerous colonies all along the coast, some related to the practice of religion, while others were based on economic or business interests. These became 13 colonies and were grouped into 3 different regions. New England was in the north, the middle colonies here, and the southern colonies furthest south. Each of these regions had notable conflicts with native populations. In the southern colonies, the first to be founded was Virginia in 1607. Founded by the London Company, later called the Virginia Company, Jamestown was the first permanent English settlement in the Americas and was primarily an economic venture. Maryland was founded by Lord Baltimore in 1634 as a haven for English Catholics facing religious persecution in England. Carolina, named after the ill-fated King Charles I, was settled largely by Virginians in 1653, seeking new land for plantations. It became an official colony in 1663. It split into North and South Carolina in 1712. Georgia, the last of the 13 colonies, was founded by James Oglethorpe in 1732. It was initially a place for debtors and poor individuals from England and a buffer zone against Spanish Florida. Since the Virginia colony was founded so early on, it faced the earliest pushback. English expansion into Powhatan territories and competition for resources led to early skirmishes and the first of 3 wars with the Powhatan Confederacy. In 1610, after a particularly harsh winter known as the Starving Time, Lord Delaware arrived in Jamestown with military reinforcements and launched a series of attacks on Powhatan communities, burning villages and crops. The war ended with a period of relative peace, symbolized by the marriage of Pocahontas, a Powhatan woman, to John Rolfe, an English settler, in 1614. But the English continued their encroachment on Powhatan lands, leading to a second war. The war began in 1622 with a surprise attack organized by Chief Opechancanough, Pocahontas' uncle. The attack targeted English settlements and resulted in the deaths of about a quarter of the English colonists. In retaliation, the English launched several punitive expeditions. An uneasy truce was established in 1632. But tensions remained high, with the English continuing to expand and solidify their settlements. Chief Opechancanough, despite being elderly, organized another coordinated series of attacks on English settlements in 1644. The attacks resulted in the deaths of several hundred colonists. Once again, the English responded with retaliatory attacks. This time, Opechancanough was captured and killed by an English guard. The Treaty of 1646 formally ended the conflict, marking the end of the Powhatan Confederacy's organized resistance to English expansion. The treaty also established boundaries between English and Powhatan lands, although these boundaries were still gradually encroached upon by the English. During the 1670s, there was still more unrest in the Virginia colony at Jamestown. But this time, it came from within. Often the victims of raids, settlers became frustrated with Governor William Berkeley's reluctance to drive the natives out of Virginia. They felt that the governor and the rest of his wealthy administration kept the natives around to maximize trade opportunities. Dissatisfied, a merchant named Nathaniel Bacon led thousands of Virginians from all walks of life, small planters, merchants, indentured servants, and African slaves, in an uprising against Berkeley in 1676. They chased him out of Jamestown as they burned it to the ground. Bacon died of dysentery soon after, and by 1677, the rebellion was quelled by the colonial elite. Alarmed by the alliance of merchants, servants, African laborers, and slaves, they instituted the Virginia Slave Codes of 1705 to reinforce racial divisions and prevent similar uprisings. They came to rely less on European indentured servants and more on imported African slaves. Heading north, we get to the Middle Colonies. New York was originally settled by the Dutch in 1626 as New Netherland and included New Amsterdam. It was captured by the English in 1664 and renamed after the Duke of York as New York. New Jersey was originally part of New Netherland and was taken by the English and split into East and West Jersey, eventually uniting as a single royal colony. Delaware was initially a Swedish colony and trading post set up in 1638, named New Sweden. It fell under Dutch and then English control and was eventually governed as part of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was founded by William Penn in 1682 as a Quaker colony based on principles of religious tolerance and good relations with Native Americans. Most of the major colonial conflicts were conducted earlier by the Dutch in this region. Still heading further north, we get to the New England colonies. Massachusetts was initially settled by the Pilgrims in 1620 at Plymouth, who were seeking religious freedom. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was later established by Puritans in 1630, also seeking to practice their religion freely. New Hampshire was established in 1623 by John Mason and others for fishing and trade. It was originally a part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, but later became a separate colony. Connecticut was initially settled in 1636 by people from Massachusetts seeking more land and political freedom. Thomas Hooker led many of the early settlers. Rhode Island was also established in 1636 by Roger Williams after he was banished from Massachusetts Bay Colony for his religious views. It was founded on principles of complete religious tolerance. One notable conflict in this region, and also the first of large scale, was the Pequot War, which resulted in the near destruction of the Pequot tribe. An alliance of New England colonies defeated the Pequot at the Great Swamp Fight, leading to the dissolution of the native people. One of the most devastating conflicts in American colonial history, both in terms of its sheer violence and its long-term impact on Native American communities, occurred later in New England. This was King Philip's War. Tensions flared after the execution of 3 Wampanoags by the English for the murder of a Christian Native American, leading to a spiral of retaliatory violence. The war began with raids on colonial settlements and spread rapidly throughout New England by a coalition of Native Americans, led by Metacomet. Metacomet was known to the English as King Philip, giving the war its name. The fighting was characterized by guerrilla warfare tactics, with Native American forces often utilizing hit-and-run strategies. Notable events included the Siege of Brookfield, the Great Swamp Fight, a significant colonial victory, and the eventual capture and killing of Metacom in 1676. Numerous atrocities were committed by both sides, with civilian populations frequently targeted. In the end, it was a devastating defeat for the Native American tribes of New England. Many Native Americans were killed in battle, while others succumbed to starvation or disease. King Philip's War, in terms of the percentage of the population killed, remains one of the deadliest wars in American history. The war marked the end of a relatively peaceful era of coexistence between the English settlers and the Native American tribes in New England. It set the stage for future policies and attitudes of English settlers towards Native Americans, which were characterized by mistrust. The Swedish, who had a small colony during the mid-1600s, were the only ones with no documented hostility with native populations. But both Sweden and the Netherlands found themselves without any mainland colonies by the mid-1600s, and it was the English and French who became the main European rivals on the continent. During the late 1660s, as affairs soured in Europe, so too did it come to affect the colonies. From the late 1600s into the mid-1700s, Europe was caught up in 4 major wars. 2 of these, the War of the Grand Alliance and War of Spanish Succession, we've covered in our episode on early modern Europe, while the War of Austrian Succession and 7 Years' War were covered in this current episode. But each had profound effects on the colonies, causing conflict in North America that mirrored that of Europe. Instead of fighting those of the eastern woodlands, the British and French settlers fought each other more directly, with support from the natives. The War of the Grand Alliance was a major European conflict that pitted Louis XIV of France against a coalition of European nations, including England, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and others. The Grand Alliance was formed in response to French aggression and territorial ambitions in Europe. In North America, fighting began during the culmination of the previous Beaver Wars and was centered on control of the fur trade. The war was named King William's War, in honor of King William III of England, who had taken the throne in 1689 after the Glorious Revolution, and was one of the main European opponents of Louis XIV during the War of the Grand Alliance. It was fought in many different theaters. In retaliation for the Iroquois raid on Lachine, which we mentioned earlier, the French and their allies in the Wabanaki Confederacy, Algonquin and Kahnawake, raided settlements in New England and upstate New York. In 1690, French and Native American forces attacked the village of Schenectady in New York, burning it and killing many of its inhabitants, what is known as the Schenectady Massacre. So the English colonies planned a full invasion of New France. Along the coast, New England scored a decisive victory at the Battle of Port Royal against the Acadian colony of New France. Though the Acadians surrendered with little resistance, the New Englanders' violent plunder afterwards soured relations with the local residents. They later attempted an ambitious attack on Quebec City itself, the capital. But Governor-General Frontenac had heard of the fall of Port Royal and was prepared. He famously rejected a premature surrender and let Quebec's defenses speak for themselves. Under a storm of cannon fire and aid from local militias, the French successfully repelled the English. Deep in northern Canada, fighting was much more small-scale as the French and English battled over the York Factory. At the Battle of Hudson's Bay, the French were on the verge of losing their single sinking warship, when a final broadside attack detonated the English ship's powder kegs, blowing it apart. King William's War and the War of the Grand Alliance ended with the Treaty of Ryswick in 1697, which restored states to their pre-war territories, but did little to resolve the colonial disputes. The next war came just a few years later with the War of Spanish Succession. Louis XIV of France wanted to place his grandson, Philip of Anjou, on the Spanish throne, which would have upset the balance of power in Europe. In response, a coalition of European nations, including England, Austria, the Dutch Republic, and several other states, opposed French ambitions. In North America, the conflict looked very much like the previous war. although the Iroquois, or Haudenosaunee, played a more neutral role. The war was named Queen Anne's War in recognition of the Queen of England and later Great Britain. As the Spanish were allied with the French, fighting wasn't just contained to the north, but spread into the southern colonies, who were within striking distance of Spanish Florida. In 1702, English colonial forces from the province of Carolina attempted, but failed, to capture the Spanish fort at St. Augustine in Florida. In New England, raids were conducted by French and Native American forces. In 1704, one of the most significant was the attack on the Massachusetts Bay settlement of Deerfield. In 1710, English forces managed to capture Port Royal once again, a key French stronghold in Acadia. This effectively gave the English control over Acadia, which they renamed Nova Scotia. The war concluded with the signing of the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. This was more significant than the last, as France ceded Newfoundland, Acadia, and its claims to the Hudson Bay region to Britain. This left New France with an under-controlled Louisiana and the region around the St. Lawrence River, Canada. A few decades later, the War of Austrian Succession broke out in Europe, and hostilities between English and French continued in North America. The war was named King George's War, after King George II of Great Britain, who reigned during this period. The French retained their allies in the Wabanaki, and the Haudenosaunee supported the British. In 1745, in a significant expedition, New England colonial forces, with a fleet of British Royal Navy ships, captured the French fortress of Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island. This victory was a major morale boost for the British colonists. The war in North America concluded as part of the broader peace settlement with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748. The treaty returned Louisbourg to France in exchange for territories in India and the Low Countries, a decision deeply unpopular among British colonists who had expended considerable effort in capturing the fortress. Less than a decade later, the most significant European war began, and quickly turned into a global conflict that lasted from 1756 to 1763, though active hostilities began earlier in some regions, such as North America. The 7 Years' War dealt with global dominance and colonial competition on multiple continents, with major theaters including Europe, the Caribbean, West Africa, India, and the Philippines. In North America, this was called the French and Indian War. Tensions began when the British attempted to build a fort in the Ohio Valley, at the time an area claimed by the French, evidenced by their large Fort Duquesne at the confluence of the river. As neither side was formally at war, the French warned them to cease their encroachment. But a young British commander, just 22 years old, planned a raid, and with the help of Mingo allies, successfully ambushed the French scouting party, including military officer Jumonville. The British commander then retreated to a newly built Fort Necessity, but the French counterattacked. The battle was short, and low on ammunition, high on liquor, and heavily outnumbered, negotiations began. The French stressed that all they wanted was to avenge the murder of one of their officers, and also to prevent any establishment being made on the lands of their king. They also threatened that their native allies would soon be there, and better to surrender now than risk getting scalped. The British commander looked over the negotiation document, and not understanding a word of French, gave it to his interpreter. They finally surrendered and were allowed safe passage. And so, this young man, named George Washington, would be free to change the course of history. After losing much territory following Queen Anne's War, the French kept expanding inland, and had numerous forts set up in Louisiana. But though their holdings were expansive, they were still very sparsely controlled and populated, as New France's population was only a mere 60,000, compared to the 2 million of the British colonies. This meant they had to rely on many of their indigenous allies, like the Wabanaki Confederacy, Algonquin, and Lenape. In 1755, British General Edward Braddock made his own expedition against the French Fort Duquesne, but it ended in disaster. Though Nova Scotia was lost to the French, the border region between Maine and Acadia had remained disputed. There had been upheaval when some natives and Acadians rose up in resistance under the guidance of Jesuit missionaries, during Dummer's War and Father Le Loutre's War. So Britain targeted this contested region. The British captured the Acadian Fort Beauséjour, which also cut off the important Fort Louisbourg from Quebec. To further starve the fortress and consolidate their dominance in the region, the British forcibly removed the Acadians. Many ended up in France or among the 13 colonies in disparate groups. Many eventually found their way back home to Acadia, but only if they swore an oath of allegiance. Others made their way to Louisiana, and their descendants are now called Cajun. In 1756, the war became a global conflict, as the 7 Years' War began in Europe and spread to their colonies. The French saw some promising success during these years under General Montcalm. After some strategic maneuvering, he led a successful siege of Fort Oswego in New York in 1756. The next year, he led another successful capture, this time at Fort William Henry. 1758 marked a turning point in the war, with the recent appointment of William Pitt as the British Secretary of State. Pitt increased military spending and focused on defeating France in North America, while the French crown focused more resources on the war in Europe. In 1758, an expedition was led into the Ohio Valley once again, to finally take down Fort Duquesne. While the French and their allies defended it against the British advance party, they realized they didn't have the manpower or resources to hold on to it, so they chose a strategic retreat. Before leaving, the French destroyed Fort Duquesne, setting fire to prevent it from falling intact into British hands. When the British main expedition arrived, they found the fort in ruins. The British, claiming the Ohio Valley, built a new fort, Fort Pitt, which lay on the site of what would become the city of Pittsburgh. In the Atlantic Theater, Fort Louisbourg also fell in 1758, a major blow to the French, as it was, after Quebec, their second biggest economic hub. It was then no surprise that the next target would be the capital of all New France, and in 1759 they launched an attack on Quebec City. The British, led by General James Wolfe, defeated the French under the Marquis de Montcalm on the Plains of Abraham, leading to the British capture of Quebec. Montreal capitulated in 1760, and the crux of New France vanished. The war concluded with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. France ceded nearly all of its North American territories to Britain, most everything east of the Mississippi, including Canada, while Spain received Louisiana. Spain, which had entered the war later, ceded Florida to Britain but received territories in the Philippines and Cuba from them in return. The results of this war significantly reshaped the colonial landscape, with Britain emerging as the dominant colonial power in North America. But Native Americans, under leaders like Pontiac, an Odawa war chief, grew increasingly dissatisfied with the new British policies under General Jeffrey Amherst. In 1763, a large coalition of Native American forces, led by Pontiac and others, launched coordinated attacks on British forts and settlements in the Great Lakes region, Ohio Valley, and the Illinois country. In May, Pontiac organized a sneak raid on the British Fort Detroit, originally a French fort, but it ended in stalemate. The siege of Fort Pitt happened concurrently, with the goal of driving the British from the Ohio Valley. In June 1763, during a parley at the fort, British officers knowingly gave representatives of the besieging Native Americans blankets and a handkerchief that had been used by smallpox patients. This event is often cited as one of the earliest examples of biological warfare. It is still unclear how effective the smallpox blankets were in spreading the disease, as transmission rather primarily occurs through airborne droplets. While the siege ultimately failed, numerous smaller forts fell at the height of Pontiac's rebellion, and the British government had to issue a royal proclamation at the close of the French and Indian War. This set the Proclamation Line, a boundary set along the Appalachian Mountains, forbidding settlers from encroaching west, aiming to prevent further conflicts with Native Americans. This caused widespread discontent among colonists, especially land speculators and settlers who wanted to move westward. Some settlers also felt the British government wasn't doing enough to protect them, so they made their own vigilante groups, the most brutal being the Paxton Boys. They raided native villages, killing many civilians and those taken prisoner. It was only after the intervention of Benjamin Franklin that the Paxton Boys stopped. By 1764, the British military, led by officers like Colonel Henry Bouquet and General Thomas Gage, launched counter-offensives. They regained control of lost territories and pursued a dual strategy of military action and diplomacy to isolate Pontiac and his allies. Weakened and facing dwindling support, Pontiac eventually sought peace, and the war ended in 1766. But it had a lasting impact on relations and the future policies of the British Empire in North America. It influenced the British government's decision to keep a standing army in the colonies, contributing to even more colonial unrest. This was the seed of revolution. But the strife in the colonies started with the British monarch, so let's take a look. When we last left Britain, the last monarch of the Stuart dynasty, Queen Anne, presided over the union of England and Scotland into the Kingdom of Great Britain in 1707, but despite 17 pregnancies, she died without an heir in 1714. King George I was the first monarch of the House of Hanover, an electorate of the Holy Roman Empire. George was born in northern Germany and became the British monarch due to the Protestant line of succession. His reign marked a shift towards a system where the monarch's ministers, rather than the monarch themselves, played an increasing role in governance. King George II, son of George I, was also born in Hanover, and is noted for being the last British monarch to be born outside Great Britain. He was also the last to personally lead his troops into battle, at the Battle of Dettingen in 1743 during the War of Austrian Succession. King George III took the throne in 1760, and it was under his rule that some of the most significant changes occurred in the Americas. Policymakers in Parliament had the power to make laws and impose taxes, but those in the American colonies, which had been settled for more than a century by this point, were already developing their own identity. With Britain reeling from the cost of the 7 Years' War, Parliament enacted the Stamp Act in 1765, which imposed a direct tax on the colonies for printed materials, leading to widespread opposition and the famous slogan, "No taxation without representation." It was quickly repealed after riots. In 1767, the Townshend Acts imposed duties on imported goods such as glass, paints, and tea. In response, many colonists initiated boycotts of British goods. The first real sparks of violence came in 1770. A confrontation between British soldiers and a group of colonists resulted in the death of 5 civilians. This has been called the Boston Massacre and further inflamed anti-British sentiments. Next, in 1773, the Tea Act gave the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies. In protest, a group of Bostonians dumped an entire shipment of tea into Boston Harbor. A year later, the British Parliament responded to the Boston Tea Party by closing Boston Harbor and implementing other punitive measures called the Coercive Acts, which placed Massachusetts under direct Crown control. To discuss their grievances against British rule and coordinate responses, representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies met in Philadelphia in 1774 for the First Continental Congress. Tensions escalated into violence at the battles of Lexington and Concord in April 1775, marking the start of armed conflict. These were the first military engagements of what was to be the Revolutionary War, an all-out war with the most powerful empire on Earth. The Second Continental Congress began meeting in 1775 and began to take on governmental roles. They changed their militias into a continental army. Appointed as commander was George Washington, now 20 years older. His opening act in the war was the Siege of Boston, where the Continental Army expelled the garrison British. Before Washington's arrival, the British grabbed a costly win at the Battle of Bunker Hill. They quickly realized that victory in this war wasn't guaranteed, and the British hired an auxiliary military of German soldiers from the Holy Roman Empire. As the majority came from the German states of Hesse-Kassel, they came to be known as Hessians. They provided crucial support in the northern theater of the war, but the use of foreign soldiers angered many colonists. Fearing that the British were amassing support from the Iroquois and other native groups, the Continental Army began an invasion into the British-held north. It culminated during the last day of the year, amidst a violent snowstorm, at the Battle of Quebec. The Americans felt their first true taste of defeat at the hands of the British, as American General Montgomery was killed, and Officer Benedict Arnold wounded. After a protracted blockade, the Americans retreated once British reinforcements arrived, and the invasion was a failure. On July 2, 1776, Congress adopted the Lee Resolution, which announced a formal independence of the United Colonies from Great Britain. 2 days later, on July 4, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, drafted primarily by Thomas Jefferson, formally announcing the colony's intention to separate from Britain. It was based on the ideals of the Enlightenment, like natural rights, and remains one of the most significant documents in American history, outlining the philosophical and political reasons for separation and expressing ideals of liberty and democracy. But the war continued. In 1776, British commander William Howe launched a campaign in New York and New Jersey. The campaign began with the British forces' successful landing on Staten Island. Following this, they achieved a significant victory in the Battle of Long Island, also known as the Battle of Brooklyn, in August 1776. This battle was one of the largest of the war and resulted in the British capturing the city of New York. After losing in Brooklyn, George Washington's Continental Army conducted a series of strategic retreats, evacuating New York City and then New Jersey. These retreats were crucial in preserving the army from complete destruction at the hands of the larger and better equipped British forces. In late 1776, Washington launched a counter-offensive. The most famous action of this period was the crossing of the Delaware River on the night of December 25 to 26, followed by the surprise attack and victory at the Battle of Trenton. This was quickly followed by another victory at the Battle of Princeton in early January 1777. The American victories at Trenton and Princeton were pivotal in boosting the morale of the Continental Army and the American public. These successes also helped garner additional support for the American cause, both domestically and abroad. Following these setbacks, General Howe consolidated his forces in New York City and parts of New Jersey, maintaining a defensive posture for the winter. In the summer of 1777, Howe launched a campaign to capture the continental capital at Philadelphia. The British won a significant victory at the Battle of Brandywine on September 11th, opening the way to Philadelphia. Washington's army then suffered another defeat at the Battle of Germantown in early October. Washington then retreated, spending the winter at Valley Forge. British troops entered Philadelphia unopposed on September 26, but most important figures had already fled the city, and the capture of the city did not have the demoralizing effect that Howe had hoped. Despite his success, his poor planning prevented him from reinforcing a parallel campaign to the north, which consequently failed, and he resigned his post. In 1778, the British, now under the command of Sir Henry Clinton, evacuated Philadelphia to reinforce their position in New York City. The British departure from Philadelphia marked the end of the campaign. The British led a parallel offensive during 1777, called the Saratoga Campaign. This campaign, led by British General John Burgoyne, aimed to control the Hudson River Valley. but it ended in a decisive American victory with Burgoyne's surrender at the Battle of Saratoga in October. This victory was a turning point in the war as it convinced France to enter the conflict on the side of the Americans, providing crucial military and financial assistance. France formally allied with the United States in early 1778. After the setbacks in the north, the British shifted their strategy to focus on the southern colonies, where they believed they had more loyalist support. This phase of the war included significant battles such as Savannah, Charleston, and Camden, with initial successes for the British. Despite early British victories, American forces, led by Generals Nathanael Greene and Daniel Morgan, began a successful offensive based on guerrilla warfare, culminating in key battles like Cowpens and Guilford Courthouse. These actions significantly weakened the British forces in the South. Apart from the northern and southern theaters, a less discussed area of conflict was in the West. Here lay Illinois Country, or Upper Louisiana, previously set up by the French. But after the 7 Years' War, east of the Mississippi was controlled by the British as part of the province of British Quebec. Under American General George Rogers Clark, Virginia militia, French settlers, called Canadiens, and native allies, undertook the Illinois Campaign to seize Upper Louisiana from the British. They captured a series of towns and the important Fort Sackville at Vincennes, adding Illinois Country as an American territory. Along with Ohio Country, American claims on this region almost doubled the entire size of the original 13 colonies. In 1781, at Yorktown, Virginia, the British General Cornwallis surrendered to an American and French army, and the fight for America ended. Negotiations began, and by 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, and Britain recognized America's independence, giving them control from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River. In 1787, the Constitution of the United States established a central government, which was to be separate but superior to the different governments of the states. To keep the central government in check, it was divided into 3 branches itself. The executive branch was headed by the president, who served as the chief executive, governing the military, foreign affairs, and with the power to veto and execute laws. Adjacent to the executive was the legislative branch, composed of the Senate, those elected by the state legislatures as a representative of the state, and the House of Representatives, those elected by the people. The judicial branch had the power to interpret law and resolve state conflicts, with the Supreme Court as the highest court in the judiciary. The Constitution itself wasn't approved by all states, so by 1789, a Bill of Rights was created. The Bill of Rights was a series of 10 amendments to the Constitution which focused instead on the rights of the individual, rather than the rights of government. These included the freedom of speech, religion, and the press, the right to bear arms, and the rights against unreasonable searches and seizures. Soon, all the original 13 colonies had ratified the Constitution. Today, both are still essential components of the U.S. system of governance and the rule of law, although the Constitution was amended numerous times. For Enlightenment thinkers during the 1700s, though, this was the first practical application of their philosophy based on natural rights, and went further than the European states which still widely retained monarchy. One of those states was France. As Paris was one of the main hubs of the Enlightenment, producing some of the most notable philosophers and thinkers, was it any wonder that an even more radical revolution was just around the corner? French society, as we had discussed in a previous episode, was divided into 3 orders, or estates. The estate system was separate from class, as you could find numerous different classes within an estate. Of France's population of 27 million, around 130,000 were part of the clergy, the first estate. Despite their small size, they owned around 10% of the land, and were exempt from the taille, the main French tax. Within the first estate you could find the high clergy, wealthier priests who were granted prominent positions because of their aristocratic heritage, and lower clergy, like parish priests, who interacted more with the common folk. The second estate was composed of about 350,000 members of the nobility. They owned another 25 to 30% of the land, making the first and second estates around 2% of the population, owners of around 50% of the land. Nobles continued to hold all the prominent positions in government, the courts, and military. Disputes between the nobility and the monarch would become common, but they were also granted certain tax exemptions, like from the tithe. The third estate, the commoners, had to pick up the pieces. They represented the other 98% of the population and were composed of different classes. The vast majority were peasants, who owned around 35 to 40% of the land, although most peasants had very little land, and many had none. Though serfdom had ended, peasants were still responsible for paying nobles to use communal items in their villages, like using the local mill. The rest of the third estate, a smaller portion, was made up of craftsmen and artisans, and the small shopkeepers who sell these wares. The peasants, craftspeople, and shopkeepers were hit hard in the 1700s by the rising cost of consumer goods. Also in the third estate was the wealthier middle class. These were the industrialists, bankers, and large merchants who controlled resources and the means of production. This group also included the professional class, like doctors and lawyers. The educated and affluent middle class, known as the bourgeoisie, grew increasingly discontented with their lack of political power and privileges, despite their growing economic influence. They came to embrace the ideals of the Enlightenment, and became highly critical of the monarch and a system based on unmerited privilege. The monarchy in France was still an absolute one, with the king holding significant power. Louis XV, the great-grandson of Louis XIV, came to the throne at the age of 5. Under Louis, France engaged in several expensive wars, including the War of the Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War, which was particularly disastrous for France, resulting in significant territorial losses and leaving the country in deep debt. While there were efforts by some of the king's ministers, such as Turgot and Maupeou, to introduce fiscal and judicial reforms, these initiatives were often resisted by the nobility and ultimately abandoned. There were several scandals during Louis's reign, and combined with perceived mismanagement of international affairs, led to the erosion of trust in the monarchy. Louis XV was not as assertive as his more absolutist great-grandfather. This resulted in a more decentralized administration, giving the provincial nobility greater influence at the expense of the centralized state. During his reign, Enlightenment ideas were becoming increasingly influential. Philosophers criticized absolute monarchy and advocated for more representative forms of governance. Although these ideas were not directly Louis's fault, his reign coincided with this significant cultural shift. Economic difficulties, partly resulting from war expenditures and structural problems in the French economy, were evident. These issues became more pronounced during the reign of his successor, but they had their origins here. Apart from the somewhat difficult hand he was dealt, he is still mostly criticized for his indecisiveness and for leaving France in a weakened state, both financially and politically. In 1775, Louis XVI took the throne at age 20, and it was clear he was no leader. Marie Antoinette, his wife, was an Archduchess of Austria and youngest daughter of Holy Roman Empress Maria Theresa. Both Louis and Marie were still young, and neither were prepared for the economic crisis which had been building up. French coffers were still drained, and the monarchy's insistence on a lavish lifestyle drove finances to the brink. They took a significant blow to their prestige early on as well. The last king, Louis XV, had commissioned a beautiful diamond necklace to be made for his mistress, at a value of 2 million livres. In today's money, that is over $15 million. During its construction, Louis contracted smallpox and died, and his mistress was run out of town. The new king, nor his wife Marie, wanted anything to do with the expensive necklace, so the jeweler seemed stuck with it. But Cardinal Louis de Rohan became a central figure in the scandal. Rohan was out of favor with the Queen, having spoken offensively of her marriage and Austrian mother. Jeanne de la Motte, an adventuress who claimed to be a friend of the Queen, convinced Rohan that she could help restore his grace with Marie. Soon, he began receiving letters of correspondence from the Queen, and as these letters became more friendly and then more warm, the Cardinal was convinced she'd fallen in love with him. He asked Jeanne to set up a secret nighttime meeting with Marie, and in August 1784, they had their meeting. He offered Marie a rose, and she forgave him for his past transgressions and favored him once more. All the while, Jeanne borrowed large amounts of money from the Cardinal, sending them as donations for a charity run by the Queen. At the same time, she rose the ranks of society, and rumors abounded that Jeanne was in fact a good personal friend to the Queen. Hearing this, the necklace jewelers approached Jeanne, hoping to use her to get the Queen to purchase the necklace. She agreed, and soon Rohan received another letter from the Queen, telling him to purchase the necklace and promising to repay him. He went to the jewelers, agreed to pay the 2 million livres in installments, and showed the jewelers the Queen's letter regarding the payments. The Cardinal brought the necklace to Jeanne's home, where a man, probably the Queen's delivery man, promptly came by and picked it up. As the Cardinal had shown the jewelers the Queen's letter, they bypassed Rohan and beseeched the Queen for payment directly. There was just one problem. The Queen hadn't received any necklace and had no earthly idea what they were talking about. It was clear a scam was afoot. An investigation was launched immediately, leading to a highly publicized trial that ensnared the Cardinal, Jeanne de la Motte, her husband, and other figures. In the end, it was revealed that Jeanne was the mastermind behind the scandal. The letters of correspondence with the Cardinal were all forged by her accomplice to look like they were from the Queen. The money she borrowed from the Cardinal never made it to any charity and was used to elevate her own status. But what about the midnight meeting with the Queen? Jeanne hired a prostitute, a look-alike of Marie, to play the part. The letter regarding the Queen's payment for the necklace was also faked, and the man who came to collect it was no delivery man. Pieces of the expensive diamond necklace ended up sold on the black markets. Although Cardinal Rohan was acquitted, the scandal irreparably damaged the reputations of all involved. Jeanne, the French prostitute, and the man who forged the Queen's documents were all found guilty. The debacle tarnished the image of the monarchy, especially Marie Antoinette, who was unfairly implicated in the affair. Despite her innocence in the matter, the scandal fueled public perception of her as extravagant and disconnected from the common people, on which the hardest burden fell. As taxes were mainly paid by the peasantry, there was not enough to offset debts, so the monarchs needed to borrow. Usually, there would be a central bank to borrow funds from at a low interest rate, but France had no such bank, so they relied on loans from private individuals. By 1788, the interest on these debts was half of all governmental spending. This was unsustainable, and lenders stopped lending. During the second half of the century, a series of bad harvest seasons and a manufacturing depression caused high unemployment in the urban centers and a rising cost of food. The French economy was inefficient due to outdated feudal structures. This hindered agricultural and industrial production, leading to poor harvests, which increased food prices and led to widespread famine and unrest. Louis was forced to call a special meeting of the Estates General. During its early history in the medieval period, the Estates General was convened more frequently. It was first summoned by Philip IV in 1302 in relation to his conflict with the Pope. The last time it had been called was in 1614. It was composed of representatives from the three estates, the clergy, the nobility, and the commoners. However, disputes arose over voting procedures. Traditionally, each estate had one collective vote, but given the third estate represented a vast majority of the population, they demanded a vote by head. Frustrated by the lack of progress and feeling marginalized, the Third Estate representatives broke off on June 20th and declared themselves the National Assembly, a representative body for the entire French populace. When they found their usual meeting hall locked, they relocated to a nearby tennis court, where they took an oath not to disband until they had written a constitution for France. Seen as a symbol of royal tyranny, the Bastille prison was stormed by Parisians on July 14th. Though only a few prisoners were released, the main objective was to access the stores of weapons. This event is pivotal as it is generally marked as the beginning of the French Revolution. The storming of the Bastille is celebrated annually in France as Bastille Day. Amidst rumors of an aristocratic conspiracy to suppress the revolution, a wave of panic, known as the Great Fear, spread through the countryside. Peasants revolted against their lords, and many manors were destroyed. In a dramatic session, the National Assembly abolished the feudal system, getting rid of the manorial rights of the nobility and clergy. This was a profound change, dismantling centuries-old structures of privilege and inequality. Influenced by Enlightenment ideals and the American Declaration of Independence, the National Assembly adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen on August 26, which asserted the equality and rights of all citizens. The deputies who sat on the left side of the Assembly Hall were generally supportive of radical changes, including the establishment of a republic and the implementation of social and economic reforms. Conversely, those on the right side were more conservative, supporting the monarchy and the traditional social hierarchy. Over time, these seating arrangements in the French legislative body came to symbolize broader political ideologies. The left came to be associated with progressive policies, support for lower-class interests, and in later centuries, socialism and communism. The right, on the other hand, was linked with support for traditional institutions like the monarchy, aristocracy, and the church, and later became associated with capitalist economic policies and conservative values. As food supply chains broke down, a group of market women began protests outside City Hall in Paris in October. They made their way into the armory and seized what weapons they could find, later marching to the king's residence in Versailles. On the way, they gained many supporters and their numbers grew into the thousands. Once at the palace, violence broke out as the mob tried to get inside, with many National Guard supporting them. The next day, the royal family was forced to move back to the abandoned and unkept Tuileries Palace in Paris. The National Assembly worked on drafting a new constitution for the nation. In 1791, it was complete, and the new constitution established a constitutional monarchy. Louis XVI was no longer an absolute monarch but instead governed with the new Legislative Assembly. Elected in 1791, it replaced the National Assembly and had the authority to create laws. But while the wealthier middle classes were content with this happy medium, many groups wanted the complete abolishment of the monarchy. This period saw the rise of various political clubs and factions, the most notable being the Jacobin and the Girondin. The Jacobins were considered more radical as they wished to abolish the monarchy completely, and believed in more authoritarian tactics, but they had support among the lower classes, especially the sans-culottes. The term sans-culotte, literally meaning without breeches, refers to their typical attire. They wore long trousers, instead of the knee breeches that were fashionable among the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie. They were primarily composed of working-class people, including artisans, shopkeepers, wage laborers, and other urban lower-class individuals, but would be involved in some of the most significant events of the revolution. The Girondins were more moderate and not opposed to the constitutional monarchy. Their base was more middle and upper class. In an attempt to escape from the increasing radicalization of the revolution, and possibly to plot a suppression, Louis XVI and his family tried to flee Paris. But they were caught in the town of Varennes, brought back to Paris, and placed under house arrest. Now, doubts became raised about the king's reputation and whether he was truly loyal to the new constitution. The monarchy's position became increasingly precarious. On August 10, 1792, a crowd stormed the Tuileries Palace, effectively ending the Bourbon monarchy. And after intense fighting, the insurrectionists took control. The Swiss guards defending the palace were massacred during the assault. The developments in France alarmed many of the neighboring monarchies. The Declaration of Pillnitz, issued by Emperor Leopold II, Marie Antoinette's brother, and King Frederick William II of Prussia, threatened serious consequences if anything happened to Louis XVI. By late 1791 and early 1792, the Girondins pushed for war against European monarchies, believing that a war would unify the nation, spread revolutionary ideals, and quash internal enemies. In April, the Legislative Assembly declared war on Austria, marking the beginning of the French Revolutionary Wars. Prussia, often rivals with Austria, soon joined their neighbors against France in a pragmatic alliance. And so began the War of the First Coalition. It almost ended as quickly as it began, as a Prussian army advanced into France, scoring a victory at the Battle of Verdun, and leaving the path towards Paris clear. Amid rumors of an invasion and fears of the freeing of imprisoned counter-revolutionaries, Parisian mobs massacred over 1,000 inmates in prisons. This came to be called the September Massacres and marked an increase in the revolution's violence. But soon after, at the Battle of Valmy, there was a turning point. Despite being outnumbered, the French army secured a pivotal victory against the Prussian forces. This success boosted French morale and allowed the revolutionary government to consolidate its power. And they wasted very little time. Following the fall of the monarchy, the National Convention was elected. One of its first acts was to officially abolish the monarchy and proclaim France a republic on September 21st, the day after Valmy. All the stories of the Kingdom of France we've covered, from Philip II's vast expansion of his realm, to the miraculous victory against the English in the 100 Years' War, to the unlikely ascent of the Protestant Henry IV, the first Bourbon King of France. All these stories are now in the past. This was to be a new France, the first French Republic. The former King Louis XVI was put on trial for conspiracy and high treason. He was convicted by the National Convention and sentenced to death. On January 21, 1793, Louis XVI was executed by guillotine in Paris. Less than a year later, his wife, the former queen, was executed as well. The execution of Louis XVI intensified hostilities, and other European states joined the coalition. Britain, alarmed by the French's advancement towards the Dutch Republic and the spread of revolution, became a key adversary, primarily at sea. The British Royal Navy inflicted several defeats on the French Navy, including the glorious 1st of June in 1794. To handle the external threats from other countries and internal counter-revolutionary activities, the Committee of Public Safety was established, becoming the de facto executive government in France. After an early leadership dispute, the ultra-radical Maximilien Robespierre, a member of the Jacobins, took the helm. After a mass conscription campaign, which swelled their ranks with able-bodied men, the French armies became more effective and cohesive, forming the French Revolutionary Army. This new army was an army of the people, representing the French public. It was a stark contrast to the royal militaries that mainly fought for the monarch. Back at home, to deal with domestic problems, the committee initiated a campaign to purge France of enemies of the revolution, signaling the start of a reign of terror. Revolutionary courts were set up to try suspected counter-revolutionaries. Those found guilty were often executed by guillotine. Estimates suggest that between 16,000 and 40,000 people were executed during the terror. The revolution took on a decisively radical character. The cult of reason and later the cult of the supreme being were promoted as alternatives to Christianity, which was seen by many radicals as a vestige of the old order. The revolutionary calendar was adopted, which renamed months and removed Sunday as a day of rest. These were the new months of the year. Efforts were made to promote gender equality, with demands for female suffrage and social rights. However, this push was met with resistance, even from many revolutionaries. The Committee of Public Safety also enacted policies to control and stabilize the economy. The law of the maximum was implemented to control prices and curb inflation. Efforts were made to distribute land more equitably, and feudal dues were abolished. There was a strong anti-Catholic sentiment among many revolutionaries. Churches were desecrated, clergy were forced to take an oath to the state, and many symbols of Christianity were replaced or destroyed. As terror reigned in France, Enlightenment ideals led to open discussions about slavery. Soon, a French anti-slavery group called Friends of the Blacks led the anti-slavery fight. Taking influence from the happenings in France, those of the sugar colony of Saint-Domingue in the west of Hispaniola began fighting for their freedom. This was just one of many sugar factories run by the European powers in the Caribbean. Around 500,000 slaves worked here on around 3,000 plantations, producing around 100,000 tons of sugar per year, but their death rate was high because of mistreatment and deplorable conditions. In August 1791, slaves revolted against their owners, directly challenging the island's slaveholding colonial structure. After the initial uprisings, England and Spain capitalized on the instability and invaded Saint-Domingue, allying with some slave factions. In 1794, the French revolutionary government officially abolished slavery in all French colonies, partly a tactical decision to gain the loyalty of some slaves against Britain and Spain. Leaders like Toussaint Louverture, who had been fighting with the Spanish, switched allegiances to the French. Toussaint, a son of African slaves, expelled the other European powers, and by 1801 had control of all Hispaniola. Though he never declared independence from France, he instead named himself Governor-General for life, officially ending slavery on the island. But the French had reinstated slavery by 1802 and captured Toussaint, sending him back to France, where he died in prison. Though the French reasserted control, there was still much guerrilla warfare in the countryside, and the French resorted to mass executions of Haitians of all ages, by hanging, firing squads, and throwing Haitians into the ocean, either in bags or handcuffed. French commander, General de Rochambeau, devised an even worse method of execution, which he called fumigational sulphurous baths. Haitians were loaded into the holds of ships, and then sulfur dioxide was used to suffocate them en masse. Rochambeau had created the world's first gas chambers. The struggle culminated in a full-blown war of independence in 1803. By the end of the year, the more radical Jean-Jacques Dessalines took up the fight. The French, decimated by guerrilla warfare and yellow fever, were defeated. On January 1, 1804, Dessalines declared the colony's independence, renaming it Haiti, or Haiti, derived from the indigenous Taino language. Later in the year, he was declared Emperor Jacques I. The victory over the French makes Haiti still the most successful slave revolt in history. The violence continued, though, as Dessalines' soldiers went from house to house, killing the remaining French families in what is called the Haitian Massacre. Even those of mixed blood were executed. Only Polish troops who switched sides during the war, and German settlers from the north who didn't participate in the slave trade, were spared, and given the status of noir or black. Back in France, by mid-1794, many, including members of the Convention, grew weary of the extreme measures and the constant threat of the guillotine. Factions within the Jacobin movement began to turn on each other. On the 9th Thermidor in year 2, according to the revolutionary calendar, or the 27th of July, 1794, Robespierre and his close associates were arrested. The next day, Robespierre and many others were executed by guillotine, signaling the end of the Reign of Terror. This pushback was called the Thermidorian reaction, where more moderate elements took the reins. The Thermidorians, named after the month where the radicals fell, were a loose coalition of moderate and conservative factions in the convention. They moved quickly to dismantle many of the policies and institutions associated with the Jacobin regime. The Jacobin Club was closed, and many local Jacobin clubs throughout France were attacked or shuttered. With the fall of the Jacobins, the bourgeoisie, which had been sidelined during the Reign of Terror, regained much of its influence. They pushed for policies that protected property rights and trade. The law of the maximum, which had imposed price controls during the Reign of Terror, was abolished. This led to rapid inflation and economic hardship for many, but it was a clear move away from the economic controls of the previous regime. In a reverse of the Reign of Terror's purges, there was a wave of violent reactions against perceived Jacobins and supporters of the radical phase of the revolution. This period of retribution, often referred to as the White Terror, varied in intensity across the country but involved arrests, lynchings, and other forms of violence against perceived radicals. In 1795, a new constitution, known as the Constitution of the Year III, was adopted. It established the Directory as the new executive authority, marking the beginning of the next phase of the revolution. But, with the more extreme revolutionaries out of the picture, the hard-line conservatives emerged once again. Discontent among royalists grew, as the convention prepared to hand over power to the Directory. Many royalists saw this as an opportunity to finally restore the monarchy. On the 13th Vendémiaire, a large group of royalist insurgents mobilized in Paris, intending to march on the National Convention. Their goal was to overthrow the convention and halt the establishment of the Directory. Paul Barras, then head of the convention's military, appointed a 26-year-old to defend the convention. Demonstrating his military acumen, this young strategist strategically positioned his cannons and troops to confront the insurgents. His forces fired on the advancing royalist crowd, effectively dispersing them. This decisive action resulted in a significant but uncertain number of casualties and effectively ended the royalist threat to the convention. The success in quelling the insurrection catapulted this young man, named Napoleon, to prominence. His military effectiveness caught the attention of the government leaders. But who was this talented young man, descended from minor Italian nobility? Napoleon Bonaparte was born on Corsica in 1769, just after Genoa transferred the island to France, making him a French citizen by mere months. Napoleon was able to study at the top schools in France, learning the language from a young age and enrolling in military school, changing his first name to a more French-sounding one. But he was never truly accepted because of his strong Corsican accent and was constantly bullied during his youth. This drove him to a more solitary life of reading and educating himself, and he developed a keen understanding of mathematics, especially geometry. This gave him a greater understanding of spatial reasoning and calculating the route and ranges of artillery fire, contributing to his success in suppressing the royalists, and carried on to the rest of his military career. The first glimpse of his tactical genius wasn't during a time of war, but during a light-hearted snowball fight at the academy, where he led his team to defeat a group of older students. Commissioned as a lieutenant in 1785, he spent this time reading the works of the philosophes like Rousseau, and studied the military campaigns and strategies of the greatest European military leaders of the past, like Alexander the Great, whose story you can check out in our Ancient Greece documentary, Charlemagne, in our Middle Ages video, and Frederick the Great, from this very video. He made a name for himself early on at the Siege of Toulon, one of the earliest battles during the War of the First Coalition. In 1794, well into the Revolution, Napoleon was made Brigadier General by the Committee of Public Safety, and now he was making quite the name for himself working for the Directory. The quelling of the Royalist insurrection paved the way for the inauguration of the Directory, which took control of the French government under the new constitution. The Directory was designed with checks and balances to prevent any single group from gaining too much power, a direct response to the perceived autocracy of the Committee of Public Safety under Robespierre. This government consisted of a 5-member executive directory and 2 legislative houses, the Council of Ancients, the Upper House, and the Council of 500, the Lower. The directory faced internal political struggles and lacked widespread support. It was frequently at odds with the legislative councils and struggled to find a balance between the royalists and the extreme radicals. Despite efforts to stabilize the French economy, the directory still faced the ongoing financial crises, with inflation, food shortages, and economic disparities continuing to plague France. Even so, the directory was notorious for its corruption and inefficiency. Many of its members and associates were known to engage in bribery, embezzlement, and other forms of corruption. While the directory struggled domestically, it relied heavily on the military to maintain order and expand French revolutionary ideals abroad, continuing the wars against the European coalition. Outside of France, the French Revolutionary Army continued their advance into the Austrian Netherlands, in what was called the Flanders Campaign. Their most significant victory was the Battle of Fleurus in 1794, where the French, under General Jourdan, defeated the Austrians. This battle is noted for the use of a reconnaissance balloon, marking one of the first military uses of a type of aircraft. The French victories led to the full annexation of the Austrian Netherlands. They spread revolutionary ideas, claiming to liberate the lands they invaded, and abolished feudalism. A number of sister republics were established in conquered areas, independent states that swore allegiance to France. The first of these was the Batavian Republic, established by revolutionaries in the Dutch Republic. By 1795, weariness and political changes led some coalition members to seek peace. Of the major players, it was first Prussia in 1795 that made peace in order to deal with issues in the East. Spain was next, and would later even join France. All that was left of the coalition was Britain and Austria, but Britain was more concerned with naval combat, blockades, and their strikes on European colonies in Africa, the Caribbean, and Indian Ocean. With only Austria left, the French went on the offensive. The plan was a 2-pronged attack, one from the north and one from Italy. Napoleon was given command of the French army in the south. There, he met an army of demoralized and untrustworthy soldiers, but he made the most of it and got to work immediately. After gathering the necessary intelligence, Napoleon had his route. His army marched into northern Italy, separating the Austrian army from their allies in the Kingdom of Sardinia. They were then able to divide and conquer, first focusing on the Habsburgs' Italian allies. After the victories at Montenotte, Millesimo, and Mondovi, Napoleon forced the Kingdom of Sardinia-Piedmont to sign the Armistice of Cherasco in April 1796. The subsequent Treaty of Paris, signed in May, took Sardinia-Piedmont out of the war and ceded significant territories to France, like Nice and Savoy. Napoleon then turned his attention to the Austrian forces. After a victory at the Battle of Lodi, he was clear to capture Milan, the capital of Lombardy. He then set his sights on Mantua, the key Austrian fortress in northern Italy. As he lay siege to the fortification, the Austrians sent relief forces several different times, and each time Napoleon repelled them. One of these was the Battle of Castiglione in August, where Napoleon decisively defeated the Austrians. After this battle, French forces continued to advance, posing a significant threat to the Papal States. As a result of this pressure, Pope Pius VI sought a peace agreement with the French. They ceded several territories to France and also surrendered a large part of their treasury and a number of artworks and manuscripts. After 8 months, Mantua finally capitulated, and Austria's power in Italy was all but vanished. Wasting no time, the general then advanced towards Vienna, the Austrian capital itself. When he was just 100 miles from the city, the Austrians called it quits. The Treaty of Campo Formio in 1797 ended the war with Austria, ceding control of the Austrian Netherlands and recognizing the French annexations in the Rhineland. The Republic of Venice, which had been an independent state for over 1,000 years, lost its independence and was handed over to Austria, ending its long-standing status as a sovereign republic. The first coalition dissolved, as only Britain remained. Though the broader war was over, the French pressed their advantage and continued expansion. A French-backed coup in Switzerland brought them into the French sphere as a sister state called the Helvetic Republic. In 1798, an invasion was launched into the Papal States, and a French army marched into Rome. The Pope was taken prisoner and the Eternal City became another client state called the Roman Republic. As France and Britain were still formally at war, Napoleon sought a direct invasion. But the British navy and defences were far too robust, so it was instead suggested to form a colony in the rich lands of Egypt. It could bolster French interests and be used as a base to hamper the British in India and the Mediterranean. Napoleon and his army set sail in May. British agents caught wind of this, and a fleet under Admiral Horatio Nelson was sent to intercept the French navy. They reportedly passed just 20 miles from each other, but thick fog protected the French vessels, and Napoleon lived to fight another day. Their first stop was Malta, where they promptly captured the island from the Knights Hospitaller, a military order formed during the Crusades, and who had control of the island for over 260 years. The next stop, though, was Egypt. Egypt, by this point, was still part of the Ottoman Empire, a story you can check out here, but the Mamluk caste had gained more power over time and held Egypt under military rule. Napoleon first captured Alexandria, but the gleaming city was no longer the most important political center, so he made a long and arduous march towards Cairo. On the way, at the Battle of the Pyramids, the French thoroughly defeated the Mamluk armies and marched into Cairo. But it was still too early to celebrate. Admiral Nelson and the British Royal Navy finally caught up to the French ships, and after the Battle of the Nile, the French flagship exploded and surrendered. Napoleon, still deeper inland in Cairo, was effectively now stranded in Egypt. To further complicate matters, the Ottomans declared war and sent an army to advance down from the Levant. Napoleon still had his genius, or arrogance, and chose to go out and intercept them. The French armies passed through Gaza and laid siege to Jaffa. Because of some reported dishonesty by the Ottomans, the French executed the entire garrison with bayonets to conserve ammunition. But almost like divine retribution, the French army was hit by plague. His last attempt was at the Siege of Acre, a heavily defended fortress. But due to help from the British, the Ottomans held off Napoleon, a defeat he held close to his heart for the rest of his life. He would later lament, "If only Acre had fallen, I would have changed the face of the world." A defeated French army had to retreat back to Egypt, facing more hardships and disease along the way. Reaching their destination, they won a final battle at Abuka, allowing them to receive troubling news. A second coalition had already formed against them, and the start of a second war. Britain was of course still part of it, but a new state would enter. The Empire of Russia had remained neutral during the First War, but Emperor John I was an admirer of the Knights of St. John, and vowed revenge for Napoleon's subjugation of the order in Malta. A furious Austria also joined. The Ottomans, already at war, had to join, and soon after, Portugal and the Kingdom of Naples. Prussia remained neutral, while Spain was an ally of France. The war itself began when Naples invaded the Roman Republic, and the Austrians achieved numerous victories in the Rhineland, pushing back the French. A Russian and Austrian army under Alexander Suvorov also reclaimed much of northern Italy. The Directory resorted to an unpopular policy of mass conscription, once again causing significant pushback. Still stuck in the Middle East, and impossible to return home with his army, Napoleon left them in Egypt. He set sail with only his personal retinue and numerous academics, who held some magnificent discoveries, like the Rosetta Stone, the key to translating the ancient Egyptian written language. With the Directory's popularity waning and the country facing ongoing domestic crises, the stage was set for change. Once back in France, with the backing of other key military figures and politicians, Napoleon orchestrated the coup of the 18th Brumaire. The Directory was dissolved, and in its place, the consulate was established with Napoleon as first consul, marking the end of the French Revolution and the beginning of Napoleon's rise to ultimate power. This constitution confirmed Napoleon's position as first consul and granted him significant powers. Two other consuls of differing political alignments ruled alongside Napoleon, but they were just extensions of his will. Napoleon's first move was to re-establish links to one of the most prominent enemies of the Revolution, the Catholic Church. In 1801, he met with the Pope and offered to recognize Catholicism as the French religion, in exchange for the Church agreeing to let go of the lands confiscated from them during the Revolution. With this, the Church and government were no longer enemies, and those who gained land during the Revolution were allowed to keep it, giving Napoleon a strong support base. He introduced reforms in administration and legal systems with the Napoleonic Code. This civil code was based on the equality of all citizens before the law, property rights, and recognized the abolition of the older systems of feudalism and serfdom. It was partially inspired by the 6th century law code of Justinian, which we've mentioned in our episode on the Eastern Roman Empire. Some newer laws, which had been implemented during the radical phase of the Revolution, were reversed, like the ease for a wife to obtain a divorce and their property rights. But he also shut down the majority of newspapers and only allowed writings that met government approval. Private mail was even opened and checked over. Under Napoleon's leadership, the French counterattacked with a series of successful campaigns, pushing back the coalition forces. This is when Napoleon famously crossed the Alps in order to repel coalition forces in Italy. A trek that has been immortalized in numerous paintings. But his journey probably looked less like this and more like this. Notable victories included the Battle of Marengo in Italy and the Battle of Hohenlinden in Bavaria. The war with Austria concluded with the Treaty of Luneville, reaffirming the territorial changes agreed upon in the last treaty. This effectively ended Austrian participation in the war. By 1802, the British followed, and the Treaty of Amiens was signed, marking the end of the Revolutionary Wars. By a plebiscite, Napoleon's term as first consul was extended for life, further consolidating his hold on power. But Britain, now the United Kingdom, felt threatened by its rival's growing position in Europe, and in 1803, declared war on France, the start of over a decade of Napoleonic Wars. While the French Revolutionary Wars were more about the dreams of a revolutionary state against the traditional monarchies of Europe, the Napoleonic Wars centered around the dreams of a powerful leader with imperialistic ambition. Once it was clear Haiti was lost, Napoleon gave up on the Americas, instead focusing on expansion in Europe. In 1803, he even sold the large French colony of Louisiana to the United States, a colony it had lost after the 7 Years' War, but regained from the Spanish in 1801. The political climate in France was still unstable, with ongoing threats from royalist factions and political unrest. But Napoleon enjoyed considerable popularity in France due to his military successes and domestic reforms. In 1804, with the people's support, his next move was to become Emperor of France. The ceremony was held at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, headed by the Pope, harkening back to the days of Charlemagne. But to avoid the power struggle between church and state, instead of being crowned by the Pope, Napoleon crowned himself. He then crowned his wife Josephine. He wanted it to be known that his power came not from a divine source, but from himself and the people of France. But in so doing, it meant the fall of the French Republic and the birth of the Empire. As France and Spain remained allies, they assembled a fearsome navy and threatened British possessions in the Caribbean as a distraction from a planned invasion into Britain itself. but British naval dominance was confirmed at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. Though Admiral Nelson was outnumbered, the Royal Navy managed to outmaneuver the Franco-Spanish fleet and win the battle. Though Nelson himself didn't survive, his groundbreaking tactics cemented the UK's crucial hold over the seas. With the win, another coalition was formed, with Austria, Russia, and Sweden. The War of the Third Coalition was underway. Prussia again remained neutral. By this time, Napoleon had reorganized those Italian territories under his influence, creating the Kingdom of Italy in the north. He crowned himself King of Italy in the Milan Cathedral and placed the kingdom in his personal union. Bavaria, an electorate of the Holy Roman Empire, also allied with France and was invaded by the Austrians, so the Grand Armée marched east once again. They outflanked the Austrians during the Ulm campaign and decimated the Austrian armies. Soon after, Napoleon and the Grand Armée was in Vienna itself, the Habsburg capital. The remaining Austrian forces and the Imperial Russian army were then lured into a trap and faced their greatest defeat at the Battle of Austerlitz. Napoleon's tactical acumen at this battle had ranked him among the greatest of all time, like Alexander the Great, Hannibal, and Julius Caesar. The Peace of Pressburg finally brought an end to the war with Austria. This was to be their third treaty signed with France during these wars, after being on the losing side in 3 straight coalitions. The French also launched a lesser-known side campaign into the Kingdom of Naples, part of the coalition. The king fled to neighboring Sicily, and the French appointed their own king in southern Italy. With these wins, Napoleon secured most of continental Europe. Austria gave up Venice, and the near millennium-long Holy Roman Empire formally dissolved. The last emperor, Francis II, abdicated the title and focused on his Habsburg domains in the east, the Austrian Empire. Many former German states of the old Holy Roman Empire were then reorganized into larger entities and consolidated into another of Napoleon's client states, the Confederation of the Rhine. Now surrounded by French client states, Prussia was threatened and declared war. This marked the beginning of the War of the Fourth Coalition, though the United Kingdom and Russia had still formally been at war with France. The Fourth Coalition was headed mainly by Prussia and Russia. The Prussian army, under Frederick William III, was still one of the best in Europe, and finally, Napoleon might meet firm resistance. But the Grand Armée was well-drilled, highly disciplined, and now quite experienced. The French corps system allowed for greater flexibility and rapid movement, which was a stark contrast to the more rigid Prussian formations of the time. Napoleon's forces moved quickly and managed to surprise the Prussian army. This victory, along with a simultaneous and just as impressive victory at Austerlitz, marked the rapid decline of Prussian military power. And soon, Napoleon captured the Prussian capital of Berlin. After marching east to the Russian frontier, Napoleon scored yet another victory at the Battle of Friedland, and Russia asked for peace. With the Treaty of Tilsit, Russia became the last piece in Napoleon's grand design. This was called the Continental System. Europe was now dominated by client states, states directly governed by Napoleon or his family, or states of the Continental System. The purpose of this system was a complete and total embargo of the United Kingdom. This could theoretically work if properly enforced and every state on the shoreline complied. Sweden, allies of Britain, remained out of France's grasp. So in 1808, Russia sent in an army to force them to comply with the system, the start of the Finnish War. The Russians won, annexing Swedish Finland and what became the Grand Duchy of Finland, precursor to the modern Finnish state. Portugal, which remained neutral, still traded with the UK. A French army was quickly dispatched to force them to join the system. With Allied Spain's approval and a secret pact to partition Portugal, the army marched straight through and into Lisbon, the Portuguese capital, as the royal family fled to Brazil. But as the French moved through the Iberian Peninsula, they decided to occupy Madrid in 1808, leading to violent riots. After Napoleon suppressed the riots, he installed his own brother as king. These were the beginnings of the Peninsular War. This war was quite different than those against the coalitions, and dragged on, crippling the French financially. Spaniards fiercely resisted French rule, keeping them at bay for years. But more than their tactics, this was a fight for independence, and became one of the deadliest wars in Spanish history. It was marked by brutal guerrilla warfare and significant British involvement under Sir Arthur Wellesley, the later Duke of Wellington. The war also significantly eroded support for Napoleon and weakened his forces. As the Peninsular War was going on deeper in Europe, an old enemy would rear its beaten head after 4 years of peace. In 1809, Austria joined up with the UK to create the Fifth Coalition. Eager to reclaim the lands they'd lost, the Austrians revitalized their military and invaded Bavaria, one of Napoleon's strongest allies. While the Peninsular War continued, Napoleon raced back east to counter the Austrians. Continuing past Vienna, he had to cross the Danube to meet the rest of the Habsburg army under Archduke Charles. But the Austrians gave them no respite and attacked before Napoleon's reinforcements could cross the river. Over 2 days, in the nearby villages of Aspern and Essling, the two armies fought desperately, especially the Austrians. The French army suffered the loss of several key commanders during the battle, including Marshal John Lannes, a highly skilled and respected leader, which impacted morale and effectiveness. And they were driven back across the river. The strategic move gave the Austrians their first win against Napoleon in a decade. The victory was so shocking that the Austrians couldn't even capitalize on it. Napoleon had to retreat from Vienna, and it seemed the first domino in French dominance had fallen. But in reality, the French emperor learned from his mistakes, and a rematch occurred just 6 weeks later. It was one of the bloodiest battles in Europe up until that point, with massive artillery cutting through opposing armies on vast expanses of flat fields. Though casualties were high for both sides, Napoleon came out the victor, and Austria surrendered once again, ceding large portions of territory amounting to 1/5 of its population. Napoleon, now divorced from his first wife who had not produced him an heir, sealed the treaty with a marriage to the Austrian emperor's daughter in 1810, Marie-Louise. By 1811, she had given him his son. One of the French client states set up by Napoleon was the Duchy of Warsaw, taken from lands he had won from both Prussia and Austria. The Russians were wary that this was an attempt to revive a Polish state, a threat to Emperor Alexander and the aristocracy. Even more important was that Russia's economy was still agrarian, so they relied on outside trade. Their biggest trading partner had been the United Kingdom, but they were now forbidden to trade with them due to the continental system. Russia's economy crashed, and Alexander left the system. The short peace between France and Russia was to end as quickly as it began. In 1812, Napoleon began amassing forces from all across his domains in Europe for an invasion into Russia. Reaching 600,000 in number, they gathered on the Niemen River, ready to cross into Russia. Napoleon wasn't trying to conquer Russia, just show enough might for Emperor Alexander to recommit to the continental system. As the Grand Armée crossed the river into Russia in June, they advanced expecting a major battle. But Russian forces kept retreating deeper and deeper into their expansive empire, scorching the earth along the way. Outside Moscow, the Russians mounted their first real defense at the Battle of Borodino. Though Napoleon achieved a narrow victory, both armies lost countless soldiers, and it became the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic Wars. The Grand Armée then occupied Moscow, but found it deserted and set ablaze. Napoleon waited here for weeks, expecting an offer of submission and peace, but it never came. During this time, the snow began to fall and Napoleon finally retreated. As November came around, temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Celsius. Soldiers froze to death, and morale was at an all-time low as they passed the old Borodino battlefield, with its countless corpses still on the snowy ground. Along the way, they were constantly harassed by dispersed Russian peasants and irregular troops. After a final battle at the Berezina River, the remnants of the Grand Army made it out of Russia. Of the 600,000 men who entered, 500,000 were either killed or captured. Of the 100,000 who remained, more than half were permanently injured and more unfit for battle. Napoleon's invasion of Russia has been considered one of the biggest blunders in military history. But more than the loss of his men and artillery, it was the loss of his reputation that truly marked a turning point. Hearing of the decimation of the Grand Army, the powers of Europe formed yet another coalition, this time of all the states that had previously fought the French Emperor. Russia, Austria, Prussia, and several German states banded together in the east, while the United Kingdom, Spain, and Portugal continued the Peninsular War in the west. To regain lost troops, Napoleon reimposed the unpopular mass conscription policy, and in just a few months, had an army of around 400,000. Though Napoleon did win another series of battles marching east, the last being at Dresden, his army of 400,000 dropped to below half of that. This is when the French met their greatest challenge, a fresh coalition army led by the Austrians, Russians, and Prussians, with the aid of Sweden and German states that defected. This Battle of Leipzig resulted in over 130,000 casualties, the most Europe had ever seen in a single battle. The battle became known as the Battle of Nations, and Napoleon, unable to withstand the onslaught of so many enemies, withdrew to France. But the coalition was close behind, dissolving the Confederation of the Rhine. They had offered Napoleon terms of peace, allowing him to remain emperor and relinquish his territories to the natural French borders, but Napoleon ignored the offer. By this time, the British, Spanish, and Portuguese armies had defeated the French at the Battle of Vittoria in the Peninsular War, and made their way up to France from the south, while Austria, Prussia, and Russia crossed the Rhine from the north. Despite Napoleon fighting back and pushing back significantly larger forces during his 6 days campaign, the coalition entered the French capital in March, winning the decisive Battle of Paris. A few days later, Napoleon was deposed, and his officers mutinied. By April, the hostilities ended on the continent with the Treaty of Fontainebleau. The terms of the treaty were lenient, exiling Napoleon to the island of Elba, off the coast of Italy, and pushing France back to its 1792 borders. The Bourbons were restored under a constitutional monarchy, and by May, France and the UK made peace. And so ended the saga of the genius general who almost conquered all of Europe. Or so it seemed. From Elba, Napoleon kept up with the goings-on in France. The restored monarchy under Louis XVIII was soon at odds with the populace. In a series of unpopular decisions, the famous tricolour flag of the First Republic was replaced with that of the Bourbons, salaries were cut for military officers, and much of the aristocracy returned to France to reclaim the land they lost during the Revolution. In February 1815, sensing the disillusionment, Napoleon and a small contingent snuck off the island and made their way back to France. As Napoleon neared Paris, troops sent to arrest him instead joined his cause. He entered Paris in March 1815, forcing Louis XVIII to flee, marking the start of the 100 Days. Though Napoleon introduced moderate reforms, his return alarmed the other European powers. The main powers, Austria, Prussia, Russia, and the United Kingdom, banded together one last time, the War of the Seventh Coalition. The Allied forces began assembling just outside the French borders, but Napoleon wasted no time, and attacked before the Russian or Austrian armies could arrive. The French then divided the British and Prussian armies at 2 separate battles, but the Prussian forces, though having retreated, had reinforcements on the way. And the battle against the British remained indecisive. It was soon after, in June 1815, that Napoleon faced the British near a small village called Waterloo. The army was headed by the Duke of Wellington and included armies from the UK, the Netherlands, and smaller German states. The battle began early in the morning with French attacks on the Allied line. Wellington's troops held their positions against repeated French assaults. Napoleon delayed the major assault on the center of Wellington's line, waiting for the ground to dry after the previous night's heavy rain. In the late afternoon, Napoleon launched a massive attack with his Imperial Guard, a prestigious unit that had rarely been defeated. However, the British Foot Guard stood firm, repulsing this attack. The combined pressure from British and Prussian forces eventually broke the French's morale and their army was routed. The defeat at Waterloo ended Napoleon's rule as emperor and marked the final chapter in the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon returned to Paris and abdicated a few days later in favor of his infant son, Napoleon II. He then tried to flee to America, but was captured. Louis XVIII returned, and the monarchy once again was restored. The Second Treaty of Paris was signed, with much harsher penalties. France was ordered to pay 700 million francs in indemnities, and France was reduced further to its 1790 borders. Parts of France were also to be occupied by foreign soldiers for 5 years. To restore the balance of power, the major European states held a series of diplomatic meetings at the Congress of Vienna, restoring and redrawing the European borders to prevent any more instability. We will be discussing this new Europe in our next mega-documentary, so be sure to subscribe. Napoleon was subsequently exiled to St. Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic, much further from Europe than Elba. The decision to keep him alive prevented his being seen as a martyr, and European powers didn't want to set the precedent of executing monarchs. There, in lonely isolation, far from the country he loved and transformed, Napoleon spent his last years, and died just 6 years later, in 1821. No more as emperor of a great nation, but emperor of a tiny island. As we bid farewell to the early modern period, a time of exploration and enlightenment, we enter a world that is quite transformed. The end of the early modern remains unrecognizable to the end of the medieval age just 300 years prior. Yet, history never stops, and as we look ahead to the next period, we are poised to witness a transformation even more profound than the last. Join us as we embark on a journey through this transformative epoch all across the earth, where the rapid pace of change paves the way to the world as we know it today.